The camera flashes were relentless, a storm of blinding lights capturing every moment of her poised yet unreadable expression. Melania Trump sat across from the host, her hands resting elegantly on the table, her diamond wedding band catching the light. The audience leaned in, waiting, no, expecting a spectacle. After all, that was the reason this particular host had invited her. Not for a fair discussion, not for a genuine conversation, but to mock her, to bait her into a moment of weakness. The host smirked, her tone dripping with condescension. So, Melania, do you actually understand what's being said in these political conversations? Or do you just smile and nod? The audience gasped. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Melania didn't flinch. She had seen this tactic before. The thinly veiled insult disguised as humor. The calculated jab meant to belittle. They had been doing this for years, underestimating her, turning her into nothing more than a headline, a caricature. But they had no idea what was coming. With one simple response, she would leave the entire room in stunned silence. The host's smirk would vanish. The laughter would die in their throats. Because tonight, Melania Trump wasn't just going to respond. She was going to annihilate. The moment stretched between them, the tension thick in the air. The host's smirk deepened, sensing an easy victory. After all, this wasn't the first time someone had tried to undermine Melania Trump on national television. The media had spent years painting her as nothing more than an accessory, a silent observer in the whirlwind of politics, a woman whose worth was measured by her appearance rather than her intellect. They had called her aloof, cold, complicit. They mocked her accent, ridiculed her every move, dissected her marriage as if it was some sort of public property. She had endured it all. The whisper campaigns, the cruel headlines, the late-night comedy skits where impersonators exaggerated her every word, turning her into a joke. It wasn't just personal, it was calculated. A relentless effort to diminish her and this host. She was no different. The woman sitting across from Melania had built a career out of skewering public figures, using wit as a weapon, cleverly disguising cruelty as edgy commentary. Her interviews were infamous, not because they were insightful, but because they were designed to humiliate. The audience knew what was coming. They always did. It was part of the show, a spectacle. And tonight, Melania was the target. The host feigned innocence, tilting her head slightly, as if her words had been nothing more than harmless banter. "I mean, no offense, of course," she added, her voice laced with mock concern. "I'm just curious how much input you really have in those big discussions. It must be overwhelming." Laughter rippled through the crowd, a familiar scene. This wasn't just about Melania. It never had been. It was about power, about perception, about the unwritten rules that governed the public eye. Society had always had a way of placing women like Melania in a neatly labeled box, deciding who they were before they had a chance to define themselves. The beautiful but silent wife, the woman who got lucky, the outsider who didn't belong. And when a woman like that dared to exist in a space that others deemed above her station, when she refused to fit the narrative, society had only one response: to tear her down. They had done it to her before. They had done it to others like her. The world had no patience for a woman who refused to play the role it had assigned her. And this host was just another agent of that unwritten law. Another person who believed that Melania was just an easy target, an outdated relic from an administration people loved to hate. Another person who believed she wouldn't fight back. The audience watched, waiting for the expected reaction. A forced smile, a nervous laugh, a polite deflection. But they were about to witness something else entirely. Melania Trump wasn't just going to respond. She was about to make them regret underestimating her. For a brief moment, silence hung in the air, fragile and expectant. The host, still wearing that smug smirk, leaned back in her chair, reveling in the reaction she had provoked. The audience chuckled, a few louder laughs rippling through the studio. It was the kind of laughter that wasn't just amusement. It was agreement. Agreement with the unspoken message. She doesn't belong here. She never did. Melania sat motionless, her expression unreadable. To the casual observer, she might have seemed unaffected, untouched by the sting of the insult, but inside, something had shifted. She had spent years in the public eye, enduring every whispered insult, every headline designed to strip her of her dignity. She had heard it all, the jokes about her accent, the dismissive comments about her intelligence, the cruel speculations about her marriage. They never looked past the surface. They never cared to. To them, she had been a silent figure in a world of loud voices, an outsider who had no right to stand on their stage. And for a long time, she had accepted it. She had let them define her, let them laugh at her expense. She had chosen silence, believing that rising above the noise was the best defense. But in this moment, as she sat in front of an audience that had already decided she was nothing more than a punchline, she realized something. Silence was no longer an option, because silence had never protected her. It had only emboldened them. The host tapped her pen against the desk, waiting. The audience waited. They wanted to see her falter, to watch her stumble through an awkward response, to confirm what they had already convinced themselves was true, that she wasn't sharp enough, quick enough, strong enough to hold her own. And for a brief second, a dangerous thought crept into her mind. What if they were right? What if all these years of being dismissed and diminished had some truth to them? What if she was never meant to be anything more than a background figure, a name attached to a more powerful man? What if standing up now, here in front of a hostile audience, was pointless? The doubt clawed at her, just as it had for years. But then, another voice, quieter yet infinitely stronger, pushed through. No, they were wrong. They had always been wrong, and they were about to find out just how wrong they had been. In that moment, she made her choice. She wasn't going to defend herself. She wasn't going to explain. She wasn't going to justify her place at the table. Instead, she was going to make them listen, and once she spoke, they would never look at her the same way again. Melania exhaled slowly, steadying herself, her eyes locking onto the host with a quiet intensity. The laughter in the studio had already begun to fade, the anticipation thickening as the audience sensed something shifting, something they hadn't expected. The host, still smug, still convinced she had won, leaned forward slightly, waiting for the reaction she was sure would validate her superiority. Melania didn't give it to her. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into the faintest smile. Not of amusement, but of something far more dangerous. Pity. Then, with perfect composure, she spoke. "I find it interesting," she said, her voice smooth, deliberate, with a razor-sharp edge hidden beneath her accent. "How women who claim to support other women are always the first to tear them down when they do not fit their idea of what a woman should be." The air in the room changed instantly. The host's smirk wavered, just for a fraction of a second, before she quickly masked it with a forced laugh. "Oh, come on, Melania. It was just a joke." Melania didn't let her finish. "A joke," she repeated, her voice unwavering. "Yes, I've heard many of these jokes before. About my accent, about my intelligence, about my marriage." She paused for effect, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. "But the joke is not on me." The audience was no longer laughing. The host, for the first time, looked uneasy. She had played this game many times before, poking and prodding until her guests squirmed. But this was different. Melania wasn't squirming. She wasn't scrambling for a response. She was controlling the conversation now, steering it into uncharted waters. The host cleared her throat, shifting slightly in her seat. "I think you might be taking this a little too seriously." Melania held up a single finger, and just like that, the woman fell silent. It was stunning, the way power could shift so suddenly. Just moments ago, the host had been in complete control, basking in the attention, feeding off the audience's reactions. Now, she was trapped in a moment she had never prepared for, a moment where she was no longer the one dictating the pace. Melania leaned forward, her voice softer now, but no less commanding. For years, people like you have tried to tell me who I am. You have laughed at me, dismissed me, pretended I am not worthy of respect. You think because I speak softly, because I choose my words carefully, that I do not understand. But let me tell you something. She paused. I understand everything. The silence was absolute. You, and many others, like you, believe power comes from how loud you can speak, she continued, her gaze never wavering. You think strength is about shouting the most, insulting the best, making others feel small. But real strength, real power. She shook her head slightly, letting her words cut through the tension like a blade. That comes from knowing when to speak and when to let others reveal their own ignorance. The host's face had gone rigid, her fingers tightening around her cue cards. Melania saw it, and she wasn't done. I have met world leaders. I have sat in rooms where the future of nations was being decided. I have spoken with people who have built empires and people who have lost them. And do you know what I have learned? She let the question hang for a moment, drawing in the entire room. The most powerful people in the world, she said, her voice softer now, but carrying even more weight. Do not need to prove themselves by belittling others. The host swallowed, clearly struggling to maintain her composure. The audience, now fully enraptured, was no longer laughing. They were watching something rare, something they had not expected. A complete and total reversal. The woman who had been meant to be the punchline was now commanding the stage, her presence towering over the host who had invited her here to be humiliated. Melania smiled then, slow and knowing, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. And the irony, she added, her eyes locking onto the host one last time, is that while you sat here trying to make me feel small, you only managed to show the world how small you really are. The host opened her mouth, but no words came out, because there was nothing left to say. The silence stretched on, heavy and undeniable. The host, once so smug and self-assured, now sat frozen, her carefully curated persona cracking under the weight of the moment. The audience, who had come expecting a spectacle, had indeed witnessed one, just not the kind they had anticipated. They had expected Melania to stumble, to shrink under the scrutiny, to confirm every assumption they had been fed about her for years. Instead, they had seen something else entirely: strength, poise, a woman who had endured far more than a petty insult on a talk show, yet had never allowed herself to be broken. The host forced a laugh, hollow and weak, trying to regain her footing. Well, she said, shifting uncomfortably, I guess we all just learned something tonight. Melania tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. Yes, she said simply. I believe we did. And that was it. No need for gloating. No need for anger. The moment had already spoken for itself. The clip of the exchange spread like wildfire. Within hours, social media was ablaze with reactions. People who had never defended Melania before were suddenly watching, rewatching, dissecting every word. Some called it a masterclass in composure. Others simply called it justice. The narrative had shifted. For years, Melania had been cast in the role others had chosen for her. The silent figure, the accessory, the woman who was supposedly out of her depth. But that night, with just a few words, she had reclaimed her own story. The fallout for the host was immediate. Sponsors began distancing themselves. Viewers, many of whom had cheered her on in the past, began to question whether they had ever seen her for what she truly was. And it wasn't just about one interview. It was about something far bigger. For too long, people had mistaken cruelty for wit, had mistaken belittling others for power, had mistaken arrogance for intelligence, and now they were forced to confront the truth. Melania hadn't needed to shout, hadn't needed to retaliate with the same cheap tricks used against her. She had done something far more devastating. She had let the host destroy herself, And as Melania walked away from that stage, her dignity intact, her presence more commanding than ever, she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She hadn't won that night because she had fought back. She had won because she had never needed to fight at all. And that, in the end, was what they would never forget.